YouTube, what's going on? Wanye Visuals back with another tutorial. Today I want to go over frame rates. Are you shooting in the right frame rate? If you're a beginner, do you even know the difference between the frame rates your camera has? If not, stick around. I got you covered right after this intro. 'Cause I was made for this. Alright, welcome back to the channel, guys. Hit the like button if you like this video. If you are new, please consider subscribing. I make music videos, I do tips, tricks, tutorials, anything you want to know about the process of shooting a music video, you learn that all here on my channel. I do behind the scenes, all that. Hopefully you will become a new subscriber. Leave some comments down below, let me know you joined, and I will be sure to answer back. Alright, let's jump into it. Do you guys know what frame rates are? If not, frame rates basically are the number of frames per second. If you're shooting at a standard 24 frames per second, you're gonna get 24 photos within that 1 second to pretty much make your video. So say you have 1 second of 24 frames. If you move your hand across like this, you're gonna see a type of motion blur. That's what your camera's picking up. 24 frames per second is the standard Hollywood look, and it's pretty much what you want to be using at all times, unless you want to shoot slow motion. We'll get to that in a few minutes with slow motion, but right now I want to keep you on track with 24 frames per second. As I mentioned, 24 frames per second is the Hollywood movie go-to. It's pretty much the frame rate that gives off the correct motion blur to the human eye. Like I mentioned, if you wave your hand in front of your face and you see a type of motion blur, that's what the camera is picking up at 24 frames per second. If you decide to shoot at, say, 60 frames per second, when you shake your hand like this in front of the camera, you go back and look at it, you're not going to get the same motion blur. It's really not going to look natural. It's not going to look natural at all. So if you want that natural motion blur, always make sure to shoot at 24 frames per second, and when you export, make sure that you export out at 24 frames per second as well. Always, no exceptions, always. If you want the correct natural motion blur to your footage, always export at 24 frames per second. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to shoot slow motion, you're going to want to shoot anything above 24 frames per second. So I would start at 60 frames per second. You could shoot at 30 frames per second, but it's not going to be that slow. It's hardly going to be noticeable at all. So shooting at, say, 60 frames per second is very, very good for slow motion, and even 120 frames per second, it becomes even slower. And one thing you never want to do is shoot in 24 frames per second. Try to slow that down because it's going to look absolutely choppy. Keep that in mind. Keep that a rule of thumb. If you shoot at 24 frames per second, try to slow it down even the slightest, you're going to see choppiness. Take it from me, when I first started out, it's something that I was always doing. I didn't know what I was doing. So it's things that you got to learn, things that you got to remember. If you want to shoot slow motion, shoot at 60 frames per second or higher. Then you can bring it into their software, conform it down to 24 frames per second, and then you're gonna get that smooth, slow motion, buttery shot that everybody loves to see. You may have to rewind it back a few times, take more notes, jot things down. It's the only way you're gonna get it. Just remember, if you want to shoot your music videos, you can shoot at any frame per second you want. If you want to shoot your whole music video at 60 frames per second, by all means, go ahead. Some people do that because they don't know where they want to slow things down. So go ahead, shoot at 60 frames per second. It's not gonna look natural, but as I mentioned, even big time music video directors shoot at 60 frames per second at sometimes. It's all subjective, whatever you want to do. Just make sure you do it right. And one last tip before I get out of here, whatever frame rate you choose to film at, always make sure you use the 180-degree rule, which is double your shutter speed. So if you shoot at 24 frames per second, just make sure you double it up to 48, but most cameras don't have 48, so round it to the highest number, which is 50. 1/50th of a second is what your shutter speed should be if you're shooting at 24 frames per second. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, make sure your shutter speed is at 1/125, and so on with 120 frames per second. Make sure your shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. It's as simple as that. It's basic math. Hopefully you got it. Before I get out of here, one last thing. I want to go over into Adobe Premiere and show you guys how to conform your slow motion footage down to 24 frames per second. Get that smooth shot that, again, everybody loves. Now jumping into Adobe Premiere Pro, you see I have the clip right here. All you have to do is right click it, go on over to modify, conform footage, and you'll see this clip right here was shot at 60 frames per second. So you go down under that, you type in 24 frames per second or 23.976. Either one is the same thing. Hit OK, and now your footage has successfully been conformed down from 60 frames per second. Now you get that smooth slow motion that, again, everybody loves. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. If you take anything away from this video, know that everything is subjective and it's up to you to determine what type of frame rates you want to shoot in at any given time. As for me, I shoot all my performance shots at 24 frames per second, and I shoot all my B-roll at 60 frames per second, or even 120 frames per second. Then I use the 180 degree rule with the shutter speed, and everything is done and shot perfectly and ready to edit. Thank you guys for watching. Like, comment if you have any questions, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.